just 6 countries some 50 years ago, in fact, exactly on March 25, 1957, and with 2 objectives in mind, peace and security for Europe. The European Union today has 27 member countries, and more are clamoring to join. The EU today is the largest economy in the world. It has some 494 million people and some 23 official languages within its borders. And in the words of Pascal Lamy, the head of the World Trade Organization, the EU is a unique model of pooling sovereignty between states. This important anniversary for Europe is a good time for Americans, Europe's closest ally, to take a closer look at Europe, its achievements, successes, as well as failures, and to look at its future. I am very honored and pleased today to have Andrew Moravcsik, Professor of International Relations and the Director of the European Union Program at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Moravcsik.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Welcome. Thank you for coming. I thought I'd start by asking you, on this important birthday, 50th, what is the mood in Europe?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the mood is rather negative. There have been the usual statements by heads of state about the birthday of the European Union after 50 years. But in fact, underlying that, there's a considerable amount of doubt, both in Europe and outside Europe, about the future of the EU. As our listeners surely know, the Europeans tried to promulgate a constitution in the last 5 years, and that was rejected by French and Dutch voters, so it's now in limbo. They don't know which direction in which to go. After the Iraq War, many came to the conclusion that Europe was powerless. Many think the European economies and demography is stagnant. So there's a lot of criticism and a lot of doubt about Europe. Now, I should say, my position is that much of this is misplaced doubt, but nonetheless, that is the view, I think, of most Euro observers.
All right, so tell us why you disagree with the Eurosceptics, people who are doubtful about its achievements, its successes, and doubtful about its future.
Well, I think this is a remarkable success story. It is the most ambitious and the most successful international organization in world history. And what it's achieved in the last 50 years is quite remarkable. It started as 6 countries in the 1950s. And the first thing it did was help to preserve the peace and to promote free trade and economic growth in Europe, which, to judge by the results, was very successful. And it's really gone from success to success, although in a very incremental way. There's a single currency, so now if we travel in Europe, you can go from Germany all the way down to Greece with a single currency. There is a common foreign policy for many purposes. There are common regulatory policies in many areas, such as environmental policy. And perhaps most strikingly, the membership of the European Union has expanded from 6 in the 1950s, then to 9, to 10, to 12, to 15, to 25, and most recently with Romania and Bulgaria to 27 countries. It's now a pan-European organization with over 500 million members.
Maybe the answer is obvious, but tell us, why is that important? Why is that a good thing?
Because many of the problems that European countries face and all modern countries in the world face are problems of interdependence. There are situations where a country can't achieve what it wants to economically or in the security realm or in the regulatory realm. It can't guarantee clean air, it can't guarantee free markets, it can't guarantee effective defense without close cooperation with other countries. And this is particularly true for Europe, where you have a lot of smaller countries crammed into a relatively small space. And the Europeans have shown that in the face of these challenges, an international organization like the European Union can be successful at meeting them. And I think the last decade of European integration, which is the decade in which they introduced the single currency, expanded to 27 members, have pushed forward on anti-terrorism policies and a common foreign policy, has been the most successful decade of all.
Yeah, but isn't it also true that the Europeans almost never agree on anything. The only thing they agree on is the climate change. That's one criticism,
Right.
anyway,
Right.
raised against the EU.
Well, it's a little like saying the American government is unsuccessful because Americans never agree on anything. Of course, government is about resolving disagreement between people. And so the question is not, do Europeans disagree? Because the answer to that question is yes, and that's why you need an organization like the European Union. What's striking is how many things they have been able to do together. Let's just quote one very important case in the world today. You mentioned Pascal Lamy earlier, who is head of the WTO, clearly the most important international economic organization in the world today. The European position in the WTO, the European trade position on any major trade issue, actually a policy which Pascal Lamy ran for the Europeans before he came to the WTO, is a coordinated policy. France, Germany, Britain have no independent trade policy on most issues today. It is entirely coordinated, one policy for 27 countries in Brussels. And that's very important. If you're a small country, France, but particularly if you're a small country like Denmark, you don't want to be negotiating against the United States one-on-one. You want to be a similar, or in this case, somewhat larger sized organization negotiating it. And the simple truth about the WTO is that it's the United States and the united Europe that dominate that organization. And that's just one example of the many ways in which a united Europe helps manage global interdependence.
Still, Europeans and Americans, especially those who believe in the market, always look at the EU and point to its slow economic growth because of high taxes, high unemployment, and lack of sufficient liberalization, etc. So that its economy is stagnant. Are these facts, or are they just myths?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. It's true that the United States has had a good decade for the last 10 years. Europe has a somewhat weaker decade for the last 10 years. If you took a longer view, say since the Second World War, European growth has been considerably faster than American growth over the period as a whole. And if you look at the differentials between...
Do they also create jobs?
Yes, and if you look at the situation right now, economic growth rates right now, as of the last couple of years, are higher in Europe, and the job creation rate is higher in Europe. So to some extent, these things are cyclical. You remember 10 years ago, we would have all said Japan is the rising economy, and that it had a bad decade.
True.
Now it's coming
True.
back.
True.
Now it's China. So I think the Europeans come, the Europeans go. But and also, when you compare the United States and Europe, one very important thing to keep in mind is that European per capita GDP, so the amount of economic production per person in those countries, is lower than the United States and has been roughly 25% lower than the American level for a generation.
And we call that the transatlantic gap?
Right. But what's the reason? The reason is not primarily that these economies are less productive than the American economy. It's that Europeans choose to work less. Now you might say, and many conservatives say, oh, those lazy Europeans, they really need to get their act together. But think about your stereotypical Frenchman, who in this case is a real Frenchman. He gets 6 weeks of vacation every year. The French trade off.
They have a short work week.
They have a short work week, and in the United States, the average American now, the average employed American, works more hours than the average employed Japanese. Americans work unbelievably hard. If you ask Americans, would you give up some income in exchange for vacation? Most Americans say yes. But the economic system in this country doesn't permit it. Europe has made that trade-off. Swedes, the French, the Germans, they work less, they get paid less, and they like it that way. It seems to me that's a reasonable social choice for people to reach, and we shouldn't criticize it just because it produces less GNP.
I just have to get this question in, but Americans time and again say that Europe needs to liberalize its labor market, needs to cut its overly generous social welfare for better growth. What's your comment?
Sort of. Yes, they need to liberalize labor markets, and actually there has been a substantial amount of forward movement. If you look at countries like Denmark or the Netherlands or Sweden, they've been rather effective at liberalizing labor markets, which is one of the reasons why the Scandinavian countries, for example, top the Economist charts, along with the United States and Singapore and a few other countries, of the most successful global economy year after year. It turns out that high government spending for social welfare, as long as you're willing to pay for it with taxes, is not an impediment to growth. Certain kinds of structural reforms are necessary, as in labor markets, and I think Europe is working its way slowly toward that. Actually, Germany has done relatively well recently. It looks like France, after the election, may do well. Britain has a relatively free labor market. Scandinavia does. There's some problem countries, Spain and Italy. But overall, I think the experience of particular successful examples in Europe suggests that you can combine, if you're clever about it, high social welfare spending, a humane level of vacations and things like that, with economic growth.
Yeah, you know, what struck me is this one aspect of the German recovery was that it had to go through some very painful restructuring, changing its labor laws, dropping people. So there was unemployment shot up temporarily, and then there was real income loss for the workers. But at that time, though, the very generous social welfare system sort of sustained and supported these very people. And so today, you know, they were able to transition peacefully.
That's right.
And kindly, smoothly into the new life, where where employment is picking up, and things are going well for Germany again.
That's right. Most economists tell you that the right policy solution for adjusting to globalization is to subsidize adjustment, to give adjustment assistance, education and training assistance, to tide people over, to provide a social welfare cushion so people don't dig in and resist any kind of economic change. And that is very much the Scandinavian strategy, and to some extent the German strategy. And it's more in accord with what a free market economist would tell you we should be doing than you might think. And let's not forget that Tony Blair, and remember the British system is often held up by conservatives as the system in Europe that's really doing things right. Tony Blair is very explicit that his mission, since he's been in government, is to make British economy more like that of Sweden. That is his goal. And it's not by chance that at the same time as Britain has been creating jobs and admitting immigrants and solidifying its position in high-tech sectors like financial services, it has also been increasing the level of government spending on social welfare quite substantially. So Britain looks now much more European, in quotes, and less American than it ever has before.
And yet its economy is doing well.
Yet its economy is doing well.
Now, how big a problem is population aging in Europe? They have the oldest population in the world.
And a very slowly growing population. It will turn negative in some countries. And that is a serious problem because you can imagine the scary scenario of having some countries may get within a generation to a level of only 2 employed workers for every retired worker or non-employed worker in the society. Which means that the pension payments, as opposed to current contributions, are extremely high, and so there needs to be a rationalization of pension policies in Europe. There needs to probably be an increase in the retirement age, although a very modest increase in the retirement age would do it, according to commissions. If you could raise the European retirement age from 60 to 63, for example, you would get rid of most of the problem. And then there is likely to be a substantial amount of immigration in recent years. My colleague at Princeton this year, Joschka Fischer, the former foreign minister of Germany and even in retirement, Europe's most popular politician, says that within 10 years, unemployment will go away in Europe because the baby boom generation will all retire there and they are not being replaced at the same level as in the United States. But you're actually going to need to, again, bring in immigrants, as they did in the 60s and 70s, in order to soak up the demand for labor.
So once you solve the labor shortage problem, this kind of high benefit but high tax social welfare structure is in fact sustainable.
Yes.
Would you make that point?
Yes. I think those economists who've studied it seriously believe that is the case.
Now, the world is growing more and more highly globalized. What has been globalization's impact on Europe?
Well, Europe's an interesting model for globalization because the Europeans have opened up their economies substantially to each other and to the outside world, while at the same time maintaining collectively and individually a very high level of regulatory control, very high level, as we just spoke about, of social welfare provision. Europeans are scared about globalization. Everybody is scared about globalization and has a bad name in some places like France. But in fact, the European Union is basically a successful experiment in the promotion of globalization. It's really a pro-globalization organization. So it always surprises me that Tory Eurosceptics in the United Kingdom or conservatives in the United States are often so hostile toward the European Union because they view it as infringing sovereignty or ideologically unattractive, and some people even view it as socialist. But in fact, the major role of European Union has been to counterbalance the social welfare states with a measure of market integration across the continent. And I think that's a very healthy balance to maintain in Europe between essentially domestic activities of redistribution and regulation and European activities of market promotion and a certain amount of regulatory harmonization in areas like financial services that promotes greater economic integration.
Earlier, I mentioned that many more countries want to join, become members. Is that a good thing, EU enlargement? Is that a good thing? Is that an important thing? And why?
It's a tremendously important thing. As I said, the European Union has gone from 6 to now 27 members. The biggest jump has been the one in the last 5 years, when they went from 15 members to 25 and then quickly to 27, essentially uniting Europe and bringing in all those Central and Eastern European countries that were formerly under communist rule, plus a few down in the Mediterranean,
and poor,
Cyprus, and poor. Now, I would say flat out that European enlargement is the most cost-effective tool that any Western country has had since the end of the Cold War to promote peace and security. It is remarkably effective, and the trick is not to coerce other countries into establishing democracy or liberalizing their markets, but to induce or attract them to do so by promising that if they can do so successfully, if they can align their domestic politics and their domestic economy with the West, they can join the European Union. And in country after country over the last 10 years, you've seen nationalist coalitions or protectionist coalitions beaten in elections by coalitions held together essentially by the ideal and the promise of European integration. And that has been, for the Europeans, a remarkably cost-effective policy of stabilizing a region of the world that might have been a very troubled region. If you think about the underlying nationalist disputes and so on, you see what happened to the former Yugoslavia. That could have happened in many other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And now the Europeans are, in my view, quite bravely going ahead, cautiously, because public opinion is not exactly supportive of this, but going ahead to consider Turkey as a member. So there are negotiations underway.
How important is that?
That is critical, I think, because again, when you think about this as a Western instrument for expanding peace and security, compare it to what the United States is doing in Iraq. This is a policy that's cost the United States about $500 billion short term, is expected to cost the U.S. $1.5 trillion long term. And what's the result? It's a very, at best, ambivalent result in Iraq. Turkey, we have a country that has already undergone remarkable political and economic change. If you go to Istanbul or Ankara, you're really looking at a country that's politically and economically, in many respects, a modern country. And the major driving force of that, the attractive force, has been the existence of the European market and the promise of European integration. And despite all the political difficulties in Europe, convincing publics that a country of 70 million Muslims should be part of Europe, European leaders have gone ahead step by step with this project. And I think they will expand Europe now down the Western Balkans, former Yugoslavia, and then to Turkey over the next 15 years. And I think it is the single most important thing that we can do in the West to help create an example and a stable region as Western power goes into the Middle East.
Yeah, speaking of Turkey and enlargement, why don't we look at Europe's role in the world today? You wrote a special piece for on the occasion of the 50th anniversary for Newsweek International Edition,
Right.
where you talk about the EU being this great big other superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to us.
Well, I call Europe the quiet superpower, and I think there's a very fundamental lesson about world politics. Now, there's no question that when it comes to being a superpower in the classic sense, that is, being able to project military force anywhere in the world on a moment's notice, the United States is preeminent. It's really quite unique, and surely it must be, because over 50% of military spending in the world today and over 75% of R&D spending in the military realm is spent by the United States. I mean, over half of world spending on military power is by the United States, and we do get something for that, which is the ability to intervene. But it is often true that military means are not a cost-effective way of achieving goals in international politics. And every other kind of power that you can project is a kind of power where the Europeans are as good or superior, more powerful than the United States. But they're quieter sorts of power, which is why I call them the quiet superpower. So Europe has this enlargement capacity because it has an international institution that's flexible in this regard. Europe offers 70% of the foreign aid in the world today. Europe funds a great majority of UN peacekeeping missions and mans quite a number of humanitarian missions in Lebanon right now and in various parts of Africa. Europe supports most of the international organizations and the structures of international law in the world today. And most interestingly, I think, Europe is in many ways a model for the rest of the world. And why? Because the kind of domestic institutions that particularly European countries have, but also the European Union as a whole, parliamentary government, strong social and economic protection, social welfare systems, and a pro-multilateralist view about international politics. These are extremely attractive things elsewhere in the world. And if you look at the polling data across developing countries in the world and you ask them, do you want your economy or do you want your government to look more like the United States or more like Europe, you'd be surprised how well Europe polls and how badly the United States polls. There are very few countries, the Philippines, on a good day, India, where people actually say we want to be more like the United States. Because there are many things about America, again, no social welfare, no social democracy, a rather odd set of human rights, actually, a First Amendment that sprawls all over the place, a right to bear arms, other things, that many people around the world don't find very attractive. So Europe is very attractive as a model. And the most interesting place where you see this is in China today. China, for the last 5-10 years, has been on a tear, establishing multilateral initiatives of various kinds, European-style diplomacy, free trade, things, settling boundary disputes, cooperative energy initiatives. This is European-style quiet superpower politics, not American-style military superpower actions. And I think the Chinese have learned that there is something to the notion that Europe has its own way of projecting power, and that way it's very cost-effective.
Transatlantic relations between EU and the US.
Well, transatlantic relations are better than many people think they are. Of course, there's a kind of image of this with George Bush and the Europeans disagreeing about Iraq. I think it's fair to say that Iraq is actually quite exceptional in post-Cold War history for the last 20 years. If you look at every other use of force around the world, Europeans and Americans have actually been on the same side, most recently in Lebanon. Europeans and Americans have actually cooperated quite remarkably over the Iran crisis so far. Europeans are supportive, though not really involved in American actions in Asia. So Iraq,
over Iraq, there
were big differences. But look at Iraq. Iraq's not a sustainable policy, right? There were big differences because the Europeans judged that to be an ill-thought-out policy. And in retrospect, I think most Americans agree they were right. So the Americans are now trying to find some face-saving way to pull back in Iraq, and when they do, then that issue will be laid to rest. But most of the rest of transatlantic relations is actually remarkably close. My friends in the National Security Council now, very conservative Republicans, judge their anti-terrorist activities to be extremely effective. There have been a number of major terrorist actions that have been foiled by French intelligence or German intelligence. And then there's the economic relationship. People often cite trade statistics and they say, look, we're trading much more now with Asia, much more with China than we do with Europe. But that misstates the situation fundamentally, because the real essence of international economic cooperation in the world today is not trade, it's investment. And if you look at investment, foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, to make a long story short, 70% of global economic activity today is essentially transatlantic. Transatlantic. The United States makes more profits and invests more money in any one of the following three small countries: Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, than it does in China every year. And much more than it does in India. So one has to really put these things in perspective. There is tremendous momentum, tremendous established infrastructure of economic cooperation between the United States and Europe. They dominate research, they dominate job creation, they dominate investment, and that's going to remain for the foreseeable future.
What can the U.S. learn from the EU if it's been so successful? And the vice versa, EU learning from America?
Well, the Europeans, I think, are quite sensitive to what they should learn from America, and these economic reform activities we talked about before, freeing up labor markets and so on, is important. And I think Europeans are making efforts to themselves have a somewhat more coherent and rationalized military capacity. But I think Americans are much less conscious about what they can learn from Europe. Now, Americans are never going to be quite like Europeans in many respects. I don't think we're going to have a social welfare net like that of Europe, although it's very interesting to see in the recent 6 months, particularly with the Democrats coming into Congress, all of a sudden national health insurance is on the table, all of a sudden labor market adjustment is on the table. There are a lot of European-style policies that are now re-entering the American debate, and I think there is more capacity for the Americans to learn in that regard from Europe than one might think. And then there's the big issue, I think. Europe is a model of this quiet extension of force and influence throughout the world. And frankly, the United States is not very good at that. We're not very good at giving foreign aid. We're not very good at peacekeeping operations. We don't like to do them. We're not very good at manipulating international law to achieve outcomes. The Europeans are much better at this. So at the very least, I think the Americans should look at Europe and say, these are people who are good at some things we're not good at, even if we're good at some things they're not good at. And this is really a complementary arrangement where, rather than, as one often reads in the United States, Europeans are kind of following behind us, and if they only had more military force and more economic wherewithal, they would be as important as we are. I think that